Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Katie Ingersoll. I'm the Director of Communications, Engagement, and Strategy at SMU DataArts. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a white woman in my late 30s with gray glasses, medium-length brown hair, and a striped shirt. On behalf of our team at SMU DataArts and our panelists, we would like to extend our sincere thanks and appreciation to each of you for joining us today. Before I introduce our speakers today and get us started, I want to take a moment to pause and acknowledge the Indigenous peoples of all the lands that we are on today. While we come together on a virtual platform via Zoom today, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the lands we each call home. From coast to coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all First Nations people. We specifically honor the Apache, the Caddo, the Comanche, the Coushatta, the Tonkawa, the Wichita, and the affiliated Kichi, Waco, and Tawakoni and Lenni Lenape peoples, upon whose traditional territories SMU DataArts now exists. To learn more about your community and its Indigenous history, we will put a resource in the chat that will allow you to find some more information about your area. And we also want to invite everyone who's with us today, if you would like, to share your own personal and local land acknowledgement within the chat. So now for a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. We will be in webinar format today, so everybody will be on mute for today's webinar. But there are two ways for you to communicate with us and our staff today. The first is the Q&A feature, where you're welcome to add any questions you have about the content of today's webinar. We do have a couple of folks, Dan and Monica and Rochelle, with us today monitoring the Q&A, so you can add questions there at any time. They'll answer questions that they're able to, and if you have questions for our panelists and speakers, we'll have a little bit of time at the end where we can address some of those questions out loud. We also have the chat feature, which will allow you to reach out to our team to help troubleshoot any technology issues you may experience. We'll also use the chat space to share resources, links, and any other helpful information related to today's conversation. So those are two avenues available to you to be in touch with us. Finally, we do have closed captioning available for this webinar. If you would like to activate that feature, simply click the CC icon to turn on closed captioning. You'll be then prompted to view closed captions via subtitles or by live transcript. You'll also see a subtitles settings tab to make adjustments if you need to in text size and other settings. If you need assistance with any of the features I just mentioned, please feel free to send us a chat. And to get ahead of one of the most common questions we get, we are recording this webinar today, and we will send you a link so that you can review it later or share it with colleagues who are unable to join us today. You'll receive that in your email in the next few days after the session. We'll also include the links and the resources that are shared today by us and by you, so that you'll have access to those after our session. So with that, let's go ahead and jump in. So I just want to share that we're very grateful to you all for joining us today for this conversation about some in-progress work we're undertaking here at SMU DataArts related to machine learning. The specific focus of our conversation today is going to be a project our research team is currently working on, employing machine learning techniques to evaluate grant making. This is a new area of inquiry for us, and our research team is learning a lot as they go. And so we've noticed that a lot of the specific things we're all learning as a staff and a lot of the ethical considerations that are provoked by this project are echoed in a lot of the broader conversations about AI that we're all experiencing right now in our field and in our society. So for that reason, we really thought it'd be worthwhile to share a preview of this work as it's underway. So it's currently in progress, and share some of these conversations about ethics and equity and AI with you all today, our audience. So today we'll start with a one-on-one conversation with our lead researcher, Daniel Fauner, and then we'll broaden the conversation to include some of our partners in this project from the Greater Pittsburgh Arts Council. So before we jump in, I'm actually going to properly introduce all of our panelists. So we're so grateful are here with us today. So I'll start with Daniel Fauner. Daniel Fauner is our Associate Director for Research at SMU DataArts, where he manages the organization's applied research agenda for projects ranging from program evaluation and workforce demographics to using artificial intelligence to better understand arts audiences. Prior to SMU DataArts, Daniel was a researcher at BOP Consulting in London in the UK. He was the Research and Policy Associate at the Greater Pittsburgh Arts Council. Lots of magical people coming from the Greater Pittsburgh Arts Council, as we'll see today. And he created the project remasterpieces.org, which uses artificial intelligence to recreate paintings stolen and lost during World War II. Thanks, Daniel, for being here. I'm also excited to introduce Morgan Kasperwitz, who is the Director of Research and Special Projects at the Greater Pittsburgh Arts Council. Morgan has worked in the music and performing arts education sector for nearly 10 years in the Nashville and Denver metro areas. In 2019, Morgan returned to her hometown of Pittsburgh to attend Carnegie Mellon University, where she received her Master's of Arts Management degree from CMU's Hines College in 2021. Morgan continues to champion the expansion of equitable access and representation in the arts. She is passionate about using data and human-centered research to better understand and address the field's complex challenges. And she's an advocate for the role of arts and culture in building just, vibrant societies. Thank you so much, Morgan, for being here with us today. And last but not least is Mia Hooper, the Director of Development and Grantmaking at the Greater Pittsburgh Arts Council. Mia joined the Greater Pittsburgh Arts Council in 2019 as the Manager of Corporate and Foundation Relations. And in that role, she raised funds for a variety of special projects, including the Governor's Awards for the Arts and the Arts Council's Restart the Arts joint marketing campaign. She was recently promoted to her current role, where she oversees all of the Arts Council's fundraising and grant-making initiatives. This has included developing and launching the Arts Council's largest grant program to date, the Allegheny Arts Revival Grant. Thank you so much for being with us, Mia. So thanks, everyone. So let's go ahead and get started. Let's have our conversation today. So Daniel, I'm going to start with you. I think we're all very excited to be here to talk about machine learning. This is, of course, a topic that's on all of our minds right now. You open up the newspaper and there it is. And I think most of us are sorting through what these new technologies mean in different areas of our lives. But our specific entry into this conversation today is some work you've been undertaking to apply these technologies to evaluating grant processes. Can you share some of the basics of this project with our audience today?
Sure. Thanks, Katie. Yeah, definitely. As Katie mentioned, we see discussions of machine learning and artificial intelligence all over the place right now. And one of the things that really pulled us into this thinking of, what is machine learning, but how can we apply it within our field where we're domain experts in program evaluation, arts and culture grant making. So I'll take a step back from that first and just sort of say, you might be coming to this conversation, what is machine learning? And as a broad definition, we're thinking about the term as how can we use computers or computation to study data and draw insights from the data that we can then use to help human actors to use that information to make better decisions. So using computers to answer and help with some of that decision-making process. And it became really important to us seeing this sort of explosion of all this, these projects using AI, is that there is AI deployed, machine learning models deployed within our sector already, and you might be aware of them, maybe not. For example, if your organization is using Salesforce, there are machine learning tools available within Salesforce that help you identify who potential prospective donors might be. There's another project housed within the US federal government, within the Health and Human Services Administration, that is called Grant Solutions. And Grant Solutions uses machine learning to evaluate grant applications for people applying for different types of federal funds. And they assign risk scores to those individual applications that help inform the different federal agencies on whether they might want to provide funding to a particular grant applicant or not. So as we're starting to get into this information, thinking about the intersection of this technology and the work that we do day in and day out, and seeing that others in the field are doing it, we want to be part of that conversation. How do we think about the application of AI within machine learning within the field? What are the ethical concerns? How do we instill some of our domain knowledge and put that into these models to better help our sector, and also help inform the sector and ourselves of limitations of these technologies, because they can't do everything. So that's sort of the idea where we started with this. And then last summer, we specifically did a project looking at a grant program in the Chicago region, where we took 990 data for arts and cultural organizations of a particular grant program, and use that information to see if we could identify a good model that could help us determine, predict in a way, whether someone would receive government funding based on the characteristics within their 990 data. And through that research, we found a model that we felt was sufficient to start as proof of concept in terms of accuracy of the model. And it allowed us to really expand our thinking on this approach and say, how can we really use machine learning with this model and expand it to really help our sector?
Great, thank you. It's so interesting when I hear you talk about this specific project in Chicago, you use the phrase machine learning. And I know, when all of us open up the newspaper, we often hear the maybe broader and more recognizable phrase artificial intelligence or AI. So I just want to clarify for our audience, can you explain what's the difference between machine learning and artificial intelligence?
Definitely. This Venn diagram is really useful as when you hear a lot of discussions around these topics, there's sort of a hierarchy of how they fall. You have this broader bubble of artificial intelligence, which could have symbolic learning where it's not as much math-based in a way. And then you get into more statistical approaches to artificial intelligence, and that becomes machine learning. And then we can take that a step further. And when you're thinking of, you hear things like neural networks or things when we're looking at generative AI, that gets into this idea of deep learning. Lots of numbers, lots of variables that are shifting based on how the algorithm is learning from itself. But they're all sort of nested in this structure that you can see in this Venn diagram. However, a lot of people use these terms interchangeably. So you have to be very careful when you hear terms like AI or machine learning. Do people specifically mean that they're trying to denote a particular part of research within these fields, or are they just using it sort of a catch-all term? So it can be very difficult to see some of that. Within the work that we're doing, we are going to be using, and we'll discuss in a little bit, a method called decision trees that will help us use a computer to learn from data and share that information to make actionable decision-making processes for humans. And generally, that would fall under this bubble of machine learning. It's within artificial intelligence. It has sort of a mathematical, numerical component to it. You also hear people use the term data mining. Is also a term that's interchangeable with some of these different terms, depending on what your audience is and what the research you see. I'll mention specifically that when you see things like a lot of generative AI, we see ChatGPT and other forms of things that we're hearing about every single day, that really is going to fall into that realm of deep learning. So you have a lot of variables in your data set, a lot of different weights to the data is what they're called. And the data keeps learning from itself, readjusting these weights. So it's a lot of numbers, a lot of heavy computation. So there's difficulties and benefits of all these different layers, but just knowing that in this case, we're talking about machine learning as an approach of computation that a computer is helping us learn about data.
Great. So yeah, so we're kind of in that middle band of machine learning with this particular project. Thank
Yes.
you. And I also, I've heard you talk about a reference that we're using machine learning for a very specific purpose, which is to use an evaluative approach. So knowing that there's this distinction between using AI for predictive purposes to maybe make a decision, as opposed to an evaluative purpose, which is to sort of understand a decision that's already been made. And I know that's a key factor in this project. So can you talk more about that and why that distinction matters, and especially within this context of evaluating grant making?
Definitely. Yeah, so a lot of times when we see the benefits of machine learning, a lot of these tasks that we see, especially with ChatGPT or other large language models, is this predictive quality or generative quality of the outputs, where we have all this data, that historic data, textual data that trains our model, that helps adjust all those weights that I mentioned. And then we can ask this model something or prompt this model with something, and it will give us some new text. It'll give us a new image. It'll give us a new score, a predicted score. And so these are all sort of forward-looking uses, predictive uses of machine learning, where we want to know if I have a certain, you'll see this, if you have a certain credit score, how does that factor into a prediction of whether you will perhaps be successful in finishing out paying a loan or something like that. So there are a lot of these predictive things looking forward. One of the difficulties with these predictive approaches is that, one, they can give you a lot of great information, but they can also embed a lot of harm within the process based on using historical data to train those models. A lot of work can be done to adjust things within the data, adjust things within the model to accommodate and acknowledge some of those historic harms that are in the data. But for our purposes, specifically in this work, because it's so early, we want to sort of stay away from predictive work in machine learning right now until we're more confident that we can effectively apply these models to grant making. So as you mentioned, we're sort of taking this evaluative approach to machine learning, where we're going to use machine learning to look at grant making, but we're going to look at it to see, okay, based on the decisions that this algorithm made, the different parameters that it utilized, what can we learn about the human decision-making process? Is there any through line in the data that is coming out from this machine learning algorithm that can be used to inform decisions that we make for grant making? So this is an aspect that we're looking at as looking more from program evaluation and using machine learning to do that. Because if we do that, and we get confident with the results, and we, any grant maker that we work with or any grant applicant feels confident, then you could potentially think about some predictive uses of this tool. But it's too early for us to say that at this point. We want to really make sure that we're thinking about any potential harms that could be in the system and any implications of that historic information on this data. So that's the idea of sort of evaluation versus prediction. So we're starting with evaluation. And so this also goes back to the idea of the models that we're going to use. I mentioned that a little bit earlier, that the model that we used in Chicago and that we'll be using for the work we'll be discussing today is called a decision tree. A decision tree is a machine learning model that is very interpretable. You can look at inside, it's very explainable, and see exactly how the algorithm made splits in the data and made classifications within the data. When you think about the predictive aspects of ChatGPT, because it's just this massive amount of numbers and weights through all these data sets, it's really hard to pinpoint exactly how a decision was arrived at, how a categorization was arrived at. Our case, we land on decision tree as a useful and highly accurate for our purposes. And so I want to give just a quick example of what a decision tree is. So on the screen, you can see this diagram. I mean, this is what we would call a decision tree, where you have these sort of rectangular boxes we would call nodes or leaves. And you look at the decision tree from the top to bottom. So this algorithm will look at all the data. So imagine all the data in the box grant amount. So you have organizations that received funding from a grant program, organizations that didn't receive funding, they're all in that grant amount. And the algorithm parses this information and tries to split out the data to make it pure. You want to have all the grant recipients in one group, and you want to split out all the non-grant recipients in the other group. So in this example, you go from grant amount, and you sort of have a logical condition. If the grant amount is 0, they didn't receive funding, so they go in the not funded group. If they received any funding, they go in the funded group. So you have the starting point with this data, and it breaks out into more clean data. And that's how we make these categorizations. So based on this, we could determine if an organization were funded or not. And so this is where we started with our Chicago work. And specifically, we took that, you take this a step further. This is an example from the paper that we wrote last summer that shows a little bit more complex version. As we add more data into these models, becomes more complex on how the data splits. And this is just a visual representation showing all the different nodes as the rectangles and the decision splits with the arrows until we get to these ultimate classifications of, in our case, did someone receive funding or not at the very bottom. What's very useful with a decision tree is when we look at the data higher up in the tree, so further up into the boxes, it can tell us that those are more key factors in how a decision was perhaps made. So we can see perhaps a grant maker, maybe not intentionally, focused on a particular aspect of an organization to get to an ultimate determination of funding or not. So it's a very interpretable, very useful way to look at this information. The limitation that we had in Chicago was that we only use 990 data as with our training data. So it's very limited in terms of what is captured within that data set, but it gave us a good proof of concept that we could do more work with this. And that's our goal as we move forward, is to be able to use a decision tree, evaluate grant making beyond just 990 data.
Thank you. And I really appreciate what you said about, we learn as we go, and this evaluative approach lets us build our understanding before any sort of decisions were ever to be made by this model. It's really actually just understanding decisions that were already made and what led up to them. So I know after Chicago, this urge to kind of keep learning and use new types of data is what drove you to develop our partnership with the Greater Pittsburgh Arts Council. So before we jump over to those folks, can you tell us a little bit about how they're fitting into this work and this project?
Definitely. So when I graduated from Carnegie Mellon University's Master of Arts Management program, well, as I was a student, I interned at the Greater Pittsburgh Arts Council and was able to really get involved and know a lot of people at GPAC. And through my time at GPAC and since coming to SMU, we've had a really great working history of collaborative work on different projects where we discuss different aspects of studying the sector. Some projects that we did a project while I was at GPAC with DataArts, and then an updated version was done a couple of years ago called Culture Counts, looking at different aspects of the Pittsburgh ecosystem. So we've had a really great collaborative relationship with GPAC over the years. And especially in recent work, GPAC's been doing a lot of work looking at racial equity and funding. And it's been really great to bounce ideas back off of each other. So it's been really great to have that long-term relationship, really because one aspect of this type of research is getting access to grant applicant data or panelist data. And for our purposes, having this connection with GPAC has been really great, that we have this level of trust and we can work together to share this data and share this research. So it's been really great to develop this idea with GPAC.
Great, thank you. So I think this is a great moment to introduce and turn to our colleagues from Pittsburgh to hear their perspectives and participating in this work. So Mia and Morgan, we're so happy to have you join us. Welcome. And I would love to hear from you both about your decision to participate in this project. I know you knew Daniel, he called you to talk about it, and you explained what kind of we were working on, and you decided to join us. So when Daniel called you to talk about it, what went through your mind as you were thinking about this project?
Yeah, I'll start us off. So for quick visual description, I'm a millennial white woman with long curly blonde hair, red lipstick, and a tan shirt. And I think, when Daniel reached out, he knew that this would be, a song to my nerdy heart. Because and also he knows that we do at the Arts Council, we do a lot of work in addition to programs and services around grant making. We do a lot of research, and then we do a lot of research about grant making specifically. And then recently we've been talking a lot about how to better understand our own efforts, make the way that we make grant making decisions as transparent as possible. And so this was a kind of new and innovative way to think about evaluating our own practices. But at the same time, I did the same graduate program as Daniel. I have very little direct education in machine learning, but because of that education, I'm also very privy to the conversations about where machine learning can go wrong, and particularly in the past about how machine learning can often sort of reinforce and automate bias, particularly racial bias, when applied in a predictive capacity. So I definitely have concerns, or I had concerns, not as much now in this case, about how we juxtapose the ideas of looking at equity in grant making using machine learning. But then as soon as I saw the paper and saw the work and saw the fact that we were using it in an evaluated capacity, it became really interesting to me. And it almost turns, and Daniel already talked about this too, it really kind of turns it on its head. So instead of thinking about how machine learning might, reinforce or automate human biases by making predictive decisions, when you're using it in this evaluative capacity, it really gives us the opportunity for us to think about how can we explore and maybe expose biases in our own work, in decisions that were made by humans. How can machine learning help us explore that in a way that we might not notice because we don't have the capacity to process data in the same way. So that was really what's really exciting to me. And that's why I brought Mia into this conversation, because we had a grant program that I thought this would really be a great, a great opportunity for.
Yeah. When Morgan brought me in, admittedly, I know nothing about machine learning. It's a series of buzzwords for me: machine learning, AI, robots, they're all the same thing in my mind. However, once I learned a little bit more, I was excited to see, how we can use that to evaluate the grant program that we launched this past fall, the Allegheny Arts Revival Grant. The way that grant program was set up, there were kind of two tracks. one for organizations and one for individual artists. And we made a priority for 40% of all of the funds during that grant program to be distributed to either BIPOC artists or BIPOC-led organizations, with at least an additional 40% of the organization track to go to organizations with budgets under $250,000. So I thought we had a good sample. We received over 300 applications across those two tracks for that grant program. So I thought, hey, this is a good chance to really see, okay, we've set these equity goals, but what other things are, factoring in here? We have a panel process. What changes might need to be made there? And how can this help us, more fine tune our grant making?
Great, thank you. Yeah, it does sound like the perfect, example. Like you said, it's a very broad program with a lot of participants. And I know, a panel process is a very complex decision-making process. So I love the idea that this evaluative approach can help understand kind of what's happening behind the scenes of that process in a new way, which is really exciting. And it's always so exciting when two separate pieces of work align so well. For both of you, now that it's underway, I know, you're working with Daniel. What are your goals and aspirations for this project on your side? What do you hope to get out of it?
You want to kick that one off, Mia?
Yeah. I'd like to see what are those other areas that have been determining funding. Mm-hmm. Is it the organization staff size? Is it the artistic discipline? Are some, harder to understand, and so panelists don't connect with it as well? Is it the composition of the panelists? We had 16 panelists for the Allegheny Arts Revival Grant across the two tracks. How does that play a factor there? So I'm curious to see, what can we gather about that, so we can start implementing changes so that it becomes a more fair process throughout.
Yeah.
And I would say with that too, like very similar to Mia, I think it would be interesting, for example, if we found out that even though we work pretty hard to prioritize BIPOC individuals and organizations, or we work really hard to prioritize, small to mid-sized organizations, like Mia said, if there's a certain sector or a certain piece of that, of those groups that are getting funded more often than others, then I think it's a great sort of jumping off point for us to go further and say, what about that? Like, what about that particular either discipline or that particular, slice of budget size maybe allows just the right kind of capacity or just the right kind of staff structure or whatever to make them more successful with the way that we've set up these programs. So I'm really excited not just to sort of see, for example, what our decision tree looks like, but then to have the conversations about okay, what does that mean based on what we know more broadly about how organizations are structured, what their needs are and what their challenges are, and really be able to go back and take that a little further.
Yeah, I love that image because it really kind of illustrates what Daniel was saying in the beginning. With the decision tree, it really allows someone to take a look back at what happened and to understand a decision better, which is, again, the strength of this evaluative approach. So having you guys on the ground very familiar with the process that's being studied is such an important part of that. Great. And Daniel, as a researcher, you're thinking about this, not just in this one instance, but thinking about the broader field and the future of this research. What takeaways from this project do you think could be helpful for the field, and what are you hoping to learn from this particular engagement?
I think one of the main points is just to establish if this method of using machine learning in this way can, open up some of these conversations like Mia and Morgan were talking about, that, can it effectively show us perhaps how a decision might have been made? How can we use that information to, as Morgan was saying, perhaps adjust grant making procedures? So I think, is that information that is beneficial to both the individual grant maker, but also to the sector more broadly? Can we learn as we scale this and do additional projects in the same vein Are we seeing similar things across different grant makers, across different types of grant programs that we can use to help the sector better understand? Maybe we need to make some adjustments in these different ways, or maybe there are some things we're doing really great. I don't want to just make it sound like we're going to find all these problems. There could be some really great things that are going on within the sector that this could highlight as well. So I think that's really important, but always having that dialogue of, here's information from this model. How do we use that? How do we think about that in relation to the human decision-making and human planning? And then I think lastly, it sort of just can it provide a validation to the work, as Morgan and Mia were saying? Can it validate some of their intentions that they had in designing their program? And it's not meant that this will be an end-all be-all program evaluation. Like any program evaluation, there are different pieces, different elements that any type of program evaluation can better serve. So we're hoping this can fit in and be one of those pieces that is part of program evaluation in general.
Yeah, thank you. And and Daniel, where are you so far with this project, and what can folks listening today who aren't, involved but are interested look to and expect from this collaboration going forward?
So this project right now, we're in the phase of really the data preparation and data sharing process. So I've been doing some work, doing some studying on applying these models. How can we best do this most effectively? But part of this process has been working with GPAC, with Morgan and Mia, to ensure that any way that we use the data in these models is done in a way that protects applicants, organizations, artists, panelists, that we're not just grabbing all this data and outing individuals, or even having individuals be individually captured within the data set. So right now we're working through a process of removing personally identifiable information from the data. And we're going to have, we're working on drafting non-disclosure agreements so that there's mutual trust in how we will use this data and how we won't use this data, how it won't be shared in different ways, to make sure that we're being as responsible as we can with this information. So over the coming months, we're moving closer to being done with that first phase in those discussions. And so in the next coming months, we'll start probably working on the organization analysis, because it will be a similar iterative expansion upon the work that we did in Chicago by looking at organizations. And then hopefully in early 2024, we'll look at the artist piece of that. So we'll be able to take, we've looked at the organizations for the grant program at GPAC. Now let's sort of see how that matches or is very different perhaps from the artist data.
And we actually had a question, and maybe I'll ask this now since we're talking about the data that you're using. We asked, how do we ensure the integrity of the data that you're using? And for example, are you collecting race and ethnicity data to input into the model, and where does that data come from?
Yeah, I can speak to that. For all of our grant making, we do collect a series of self-reported race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, a slew of different demographics, populations served, so that we can, evaluate that and see, okay, where are we missing folks, and how can we better connect with them and make sure they're, getting involved in the grant making and getting those funds. So that has always been something we have collected, whereas way back before I even started. So we have that, we keep that confidential within the organization. We will be sharing that with Daniel, but again, that will not be tied to anyone's name, anyone's organization name, address, any of that kind of stuff. It will just be the kind of raw numbers and data.
And I'll add to that and say, in terms of the model, one of the goals is that trying to give the model the same information that perhaps a grant panelist would have. So if a grant panelist is receiving this information from GPAC, they might be making decisions based on how GPAC has asked that and how people have answered that. We want to try and capture that as much as possible within the model so that it's most aligned in a way with what a grant panelist would see. But that's another great aspect of this, is we might find that perhaps a specific data point is a really great way of looking at the data. Maybe there's a data point that's not so great. We might want to adjust for future grant making perhaps. So following the lead on some great work that GPAC has done in that way, but also trying to have our model view the data in a similar way that a grant panelist would see the data.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I'm going to go ahead and pose another question we got because it really focuses on your process and what you just talked about with decision trees, Danielle. Just someone posted that when they hear how you describe a decision tree, it sounds similar to them to a multivariate regression analysis. And so they're just asking, what's the difference and what is unique about the decision tree? And as you answer this, I'll ask you to define for everyone, what is multivariate regression analysis, since some of us on this webinar probably know and some of us are unfamiliar with that term. So
sure. So with regression, you're essentially having a lot of data that you're looking at, and you're essentially trying to come up with a formula that can account for all these different variables. And so if you have a new piece of information that has all these variables, you plug in for all these different data points, they all get multiplied by a weight, and it gives you an output number. In the case of a similarity to a decision tree, it would be more like logistic regression, which is a type of sort of regression, but it is used for classification, gives the end result of a 0 or a 1, essentially. In our case, a 1 would be a funded organization, and a 0 would be an unfunded organization. So there are similarities to that. One aspect with logistic regression, we'll specifically say in this case, because we're doing a classification problem, is that while it applies these different weights to these different variables, you could use those weights and say this perhaps has more impact, getting it closer to that 1 value. In our case, we wanted to use this approach of the decision tree. And what a decision tree is going to do is, rather than giving weights to all the different variables, it's going to try and clean the data, make the data as pure as possible at each node, like I mentioned. So in that first node, it's going to split the data and try and make it as pure as possible. It's not going to be perfect. So then it's going to look at those split nodes and say, how can we split those 2 into 4 and get even more clarity within the data until you get down to that classification of 0 and 1. So in our case, that appears to be the more accurate. I've tested a couple of different models in the Chicago case. So the decision tree provided the most explanation and clarity for what we were looking at this point.
That's great. And I would also encourage, we've been putting some links in the chat to some of these papers on a blog post that Daniel has written about this. But I can understand, even just looking at the decision tree, I can understand how it does sort of match the specific, there's only funded and not funded when you're talking about grants. And so while it is a complex decision, it has a kind of a binary outcome. So that's interesting. But yes, I would encourage you all to take a look at some of Daniel's work if you want to see more about, as Daniel said, the way that the decision tree was established as the methodology that makes the most sense, which is sort of part of what that first body of work was doing. So thank you, Daniel, for going into that road. A little bit of a specific data question. So this is all great. Thank you so much for talking us through kind of what you how you entered into this project for all of you and sort of where you are in the process. I want to broaden us a little bit to talk about some of the ethical considerations for this project. You've talked about how these influenced how you've approached the work, whether you decided to sign on. And I know everyone on this call has probably maybe had a conversation or thought through how they might approach AI and their work. What does that mean? We're all in different aspects of the sector. And so I'm curious if all of you have been looking to some of the ongoing conversations around ethics of AI in other fields. What have you been learning or seeing that has informed your thinking on these types of tools?
Yeah, I'll start.
Okay.
Oh, go ahead, Daniel.
No, go ahead.
No, you're good. So yeah, I mean, I think we referenced it a lot earlier about some examples of where in various fields we saw it, in art recently about the controversy about AI, and that would be considered deep learning, correct? Is that correct, Daniel? Where it's like it's creating original art out of a whole bunch of stuff that it has already there and has been used without permission from artists. So like that is one example that has come up recently. But I'm going to put a link in the chat. If you're kind of curious about how some of this stuff has shaken out with credit scoring, or whether people are able to go in and get approved for a loan, or issues around predictive policing or any of those things, I would just encourage you to go to this link, which is the data harm record. It gives a lot of examples about how machine learning has sometimes caused some really unfortunate outcomes and has been used in a way that creates inequitable results. So like that's kind of where that's where sort of the things I think about anytime I hear about applying machine learning to anything. But at the same time, like with this particular project, because of the way that we're using it, I don't necessarily think about this type of a thing as much, because again, the decisions have been made. We're not using these algorithms to make funding decisions. We're asking the model to help us better understand the decisions that we've made. And so, or I should say in our case, and the panelists have made. And so what I think about more with this is like, rather than ethics, like sort of like the limitations, we've talked about the fact that typically when you're applying for a grant, like a grant is oftentimes a narrative, like a written narrative. And I don't think, I don't know, Daniel, I know we've talked about this, but I don't think we're at the point yet where we're figuring out how to use like text scraping to be able to capture the nuances of written language as an aspect of, whether or not someone who applies for a grant is funded. So there's definitely like limitations there. And I know, Daniel's been really clear, like this is not like the end all be all tool for evaluating grant making. So all that is to say, for me, ethics in this application, less of a concern. Limitations in any sort of research is always something that I think we just name and we state, and just kind of like think about, down the road, how can we address some of those limitations, which I know we've already done.
Thank you.
I think that's great. And I think another aspect too that Morgan, me and I discussed in the original conversations around this project is one, we thought through, what are some different implications, limitations of this that we need to be considering throughout this process, but also acknowledging that if we're going through the process and we get to a point where we're saying, oh, you know what, now we've hit this point where there's a real harm potential of what we're doing, then being able to say, okay, we need to stop at this point, or we need to readjust at that point, that not to just carry it through because we can to some conclusion, but to be evaluating ourselves throughout this entire process. So that we do our best to minimize any harm, minimize those types of issues, because they, I think you could come up with ethical limitations, questions about this project as well. And that's important for us to be aware of and that we're always thinking about as well, so we can minimize those throughout that. On the aspect of language, I'll just mention that we will include language as part of this analysis to the extent we can, but that's one of the difficulties of some of these models is they can't perfectly represent what's going on with human language. And the other aspect that came to mind was that these models also don't account for perhaps personal interactions that an applicant had with Mia when they were writing their application. Perhaps there's information that we can't fully capture within this model. So it's really important to keep in mind that this isn't, like Morgan said, an end all be all perfect representation of the decision-making process. It's a tool to help us in that work. In general, on AI ethics, I'll mention there are two really great organizations that I follow a lot of. They talk a lot about the language models that we see, ChatGPT and all these others. One being, it's called DARE, the Distributed AI Research Institute, and one called the Algorithmic Justice League. These are really great resources that I follow a lot to see what they're saying about a lot of these different topics and following their lead on a lot of how should we be thinking about these aspects. And to that point, I've sort of come up with these 3 points that I try and keep in mind when working with AI, assessing or developing AI models. And I'll mention just from the start that I'm guilty of these. Even in this conversation, I'm guilty of violating some of these points I'm going to bring up, but they're our best to try and do that. So the first one is to use clear terms when you're describing or assessing the purpose of an AI system. Try to minimize buzzwords as much as possible and always discuss the system's limitations. It's very easy for big companies to say things that this model can do everything to really come off of that. And that also goes to the idea of minimizing AI hype. AI can't do everything. It can do a lot of really cool things and we can use it for a lot of beneficial things, but try to minimize a lot of the hype that we hear around this, especially when it's coming from marketing companies at really large companies that are marketing these products. And lastly, and this one it's been in my mind as we've been going through this conversation, as I've been talking, is to do our best to not anthropomorphize AI systems. Because when we start ascribing a lot of human characteristics to these systems, it sort of obscures who has agency and liability in the interactions with the systems, especially when things go wrong. When an AI system does something harmful that we don't want, at what point can the developer say, oh, it's the AI, I don't have agency over that? And we don't want that to be the case. Minimizing anthropomorphizing AI is really important in terms of this ethical conversation.
That's so interesting, especially as these systems are more and more presented using natural human language. I can understand how that's a really important question. So I have a couple of questions. I'm going to ask one because I think it sort of speaks to what you were just talking about, limitations. The question is, do you have to know all the decision points in advance in order to create a model? What if there's a critical element you didn't think or know to include? And so you did talk a little bit about recognizing limitations such as that, but I thought it might be useful, Daniel, for you to explain how the model is developed a little bit to answer that.
Yeah, so one way to imagine it with the decision tree, it isn't that we are telling the decision tree, these are the key points, split the data here. The algorithm is going to look, I'm anthropomorphizing by saying look, but the model is going to look at this data and look at all the different variables that are in the data set. And it's going to say, if I split this one data variable at this value, that's going to give us the purest data at the next level. So it's the algorithm that's going to be determining what those key breakpoints are. Now, when we evaluate that, we might say it's sort of strange that it picked the, I don't make something up, the age of the organization as a key point. We weren't really considering that as a key point. That's sort of strange. So then we might probe that and say, well, why might that be the case? What are other factors of that application that led to that? So the algorithm will make the purity, or try to make the data as pure as possible, as quickly as possible. And then we will assess that and see how that aligns with the goals and guidelines of the grant program.
Yeah, so, and I'll also try not to anthropomorphize, but the model is actually developed by the analysis. It's not you making the model, but I do think it's important to note, as you all have, the limitations are in what data is being fed into this process. So, you know, a really good example you mentioned, if someone's had 10 really deep conversations with Mia, or they've gotten support, that's not necessarily reflected in the data. So just to give everybody an idea of how that looks. Great. So I want to ask you all, looking ahead, thinking beyond this particular project and thinking about the future, how do you each hope our field continues to think about the tools that incorporate machine learning, and how do you hope these tools will be used or maybe not used going forward?
I'll start. Oh, wait, Mia, go ahead. I'll just say that my hope is that through developing things like this, that we as a field can become more comfortable and great discerners of this technology within our field, that we don't just become solely reliant on it, saying, well, we have this AI system, we use it, that's what we're doing, but to be a critical reviewer, that we can say, well, how is this agency using AI to create this risk score for grant making? What impacts, how did they decide my risk score? So we can probe some of these questions and lead hopefully to public policy that more broadly allows organizations, individuals to be able to better understand how AI is used to make decisions about them.
I would like to say, I would like to see how we, using this evaluative method, how we can be more transparent with all of our decisions, how they came about, and then that transparency can help inform grantee, or I should say applicants, on whether or not they should take the time out of their day to apply. Especially individual artists and these smaller organizations that have very limited staff and capacity. Can our results and, you know, these decision trees help them also make the decision? You know, we get cut out pretty early because we are only 2 years old. Should we even consider, you know, this grant program? So I would love that to be a tool one day for them to use for themselves to make decisions.
I would say very much of what both Daniel and Mia said, but in addition, I think, you know, I think it is inevitable that machine learning will be applied in the arts field. And I think we're really at the point where we decide, to Daniel's point, like how, and can we have discussions around how we can use these tools with equity in mind, and not just in equity in how we apply them and design them, but also equity in terms of who can access them. In our work, we hear a lot about, the challenges of capacity and also the power of small organizations, and how, if we have these types of conversations, how can we sort of democratize access to these sorts of tools, which can be very useful when used well, and how can we make sure that that is something that is accessible to all folks, to the extent that it is, reasonable, ethical, equitable.
Yeah, thank you. So we have some really great questions coming in, so I want to turn to some of these. You sort of touched on this, Daniel, when you mentioned the government tool that's used to assign risk to applications. But this person asked, do grantors use or foresee the use of machine learning models to do early stage filtering like employers use on an applicant tracking system? So I thought maybe, Daniel, you could tell us a little bit more about that example you mentioned already, and if you know of any others. And then, we don't have all the grantors here on this call, but we do have two folks who work in the grant making sphere. So after Daniel, I'd love to hear from you, Morgan and Mia. Do you foresee using these tools in this way in your future?
Yeah, I think that's a question that when I start talking about this project, that I hear a lot is, can we use this to efficiently evaluate grant applications? And I think I am not aware of any significant use within specifically the arts and culture sector, grant making using this, but there are a lot of tools within different grants management platforms that offer some of these services already. A lot of them are fairly simple, assigning scores for different things that can be used now in those systems. But again, a lot of those are very simple and not very transparent to know exactly what's going on under the hood. And so I'll mention in what Morgan and Mia were just saying a second ago, one of the aspects too, as these systems are developed and deployed, a lot of it's based on historic data. So one thing that came to mind a second ago was if you're using an AI system to improve your targeting for potential donors in your development offices, if your data is your historic data that you've been gathering on who's donated, if you build an AI model off of that data, it's going to tell you to target people that you have historically targeted or characteristics of individuals. So if you have a new individual that doesn't align with the perhaps demographic characteristics of who've donated in the past, it's going to pass over that person. So that's a really important aspect of really thinking through the limitations and also being a critical viewer of what the AI systems are doing.
That's great, and good to know that there are systems that have these capabilities already. So there may be grant makers who have this in their grants management system but haven't used it. But yeah, it's good to start being aware, like you said, Daniel, of what's out there. So Morgan and Mia, thinking specifically about your practice as grant makers, do you foresee this type of use, or could you imagine it?
I think as of right now, no. As a predictive kind of way, we don't have that type of volume that I think it would make sense to, implement machine learning to do the first look through. Yeah. But maybe in 10 years, maybe we will, and maybe it will make sense to kind of utilize that. But as of right now, I don't foresee that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Morgan.
I was just thinking, my first reaction was we don't really have the volume of applicants where that would even be a question, but I do wonder, I would expect the way we would touch this is mostly advancement in our grant making platforms. Like, I'm just thinking to myself, like, it would be wonderful, for example, based on our priorities, if there were technology that would easily help us flag, based on the criteria that we have, like that we would develop, flag like BIPOC organization applications, or flag like things like discipline, things that which I guess is probably already in the application. So what's the point? But think like features to help us flag features. I think that'd be helpful, but we don't really have the volume to need it to do a first pass like evaluation. And also, like, that's the kind of thing, to Daniel's point, that starts to make me really nervous. And I would say, like, even anybody that does have that kind of volume should really consider who's might be left out of that conversation. Yeah, because I know people use it for, there's a lot of organizations that use that for college applications. Like, there's systems that do the first scan on those, and job applications, same kind of thing. And I think you might be passing over people So it should be done carefully.
Yeah.
And I think for us specifically is what we care more actually would be eligibility checks, because that is what we actually come across more. And there are lots of organizations and, systems and within the grant platforms that can have that set up that you can do an eligibility check before you can even apply to a certain grant program. But that's not really
Yeah, it's a bit different.
machine learning. So
okay, great. I have another question which I'm going to pose. I don't know the answer. Maybe some of you have information, but we can always, do some research too. But an interesting thought: do academic IRB services, do they handle machine learning in the same way they do other types of research? And so I'm curious, Dan, if you have any experiences with that, and could the type of oversight there, if it exists, be applied to sector research? And if you can,
Yes.
if you could define IRB for us too, that would be great.
Yes. So an IRB is an institutional review board. So, at Southern Methodist University, there is a group of people that review proposals for research from people within the university. And so the IRB looks at a piece of research and says, does this meet all the ethical considerations for research that we want to be putting out there? Is it protecting human specimens? Is it providing informed consent? All these different ethical considerations. And yes, AI and machine learning models fall within that same framework of needing IRB approval. One of the aspects with IRB approval that they look at many times is whether there's personally identifiable information in the data or the research that you're doing. If there is, so if you're working with human subjects and you're testing on human subjects, surveying human subjects, there are additional levels of regulations essentially you have to complete and fulfill. And that would be the same with this type of research. One aspect with this research specifically that we aim to do was to reduce some of the IRB requirements by having GPAC remove the personally identifiable information. So by removing that, we're taking some of that human subject research out of this research project. But no, it's still, this falls under needing IRB review, and that will be part of this process in its entirety, is making sure that we maintain those regulations that we need to maintain.
Yeah, but it is interesting to think about, a lot of the applications of AI would not be subject to IRB review. So it's kind of interesting to think about, which context that would be a part of the work and which it wouldn't, but interesting point. Okay, well, we're almost at the end of our time today. Thank you all so much for being here, and thank you to our audience. I do want to encourage, actually saw a couple of people doing this, but our panelists were sharing some resources around AI that they have turned to, and if you have any that you have used or enjoy or think others would benefit from, please feel free to put those in the chat. Our team is going to gather those links and we'll share them out somehow to everyone. So let's keep the knowledge sharing around AI going. As you are all adding those resources into the chat feature, I do want to spotlight another event being held by our friends at TRG Arts tomorrow. They'll be hosting a webinar exploring ways the arts and cultural industry can utilize Gen AI in everyday tasks. And so that is happening tomorrow, Wednesday, May 31st. We'll drop a link in the chat now if you want to have another conversation about AI in this week. And then we're also planning to continue this conversation as we continue to pursue this work. Follow us, follow along as Daniel and our colleagues at GPAC continue to explore this research. We'll be thinking about other types of programming we can do to sort of further this conversation among all of us on how these technologies can be applied and what they mean for cultural grant making and other applications within the cultural sector. So as always, we invite you to sign up for our newsletter for the latest in research and events on this topic and others. And that brings us to the end of our time together. So to each of our panelists, Mia, Morgan, Daniel, thank you so much for joining and sharing such an enriching conversation. It's great to hear how this work is developing as it happens. And on behalf of everyone at SMU DataArts, I just want to share our appreciation to each of you for joining today. We hope you'll stay connected with us. And yeah, I think that's everything. If you have other questions, you feel free to put them in the chat. We'll hang out for a moment, but this is the end of our hour. So again, thank you everyone for joining us.